Remnant from the Ashes is a Dark Souls made by a bunch of guys who were playing a third-person shooter and said, what if this was a Dark Souls? And so it became a Dark Souls. Or did it? Actually, let me specify. Remnant from the Ashes is a Dark Souls-inspired third-person shooter, and then there are a bunch of other words you could use to describe it, but I'm not going to use all of those and say that that's what it is. It is very much not, however, a Dark Souls. There is a major difference between these two, that being that Remnant is a shooter and Dark Souls is not, and is in fact kind of the opposite. The Dark Souls inspiration, however, is incredibly clear, and it is definitely Dark Souls-inspired. From the way items work, to their placement, the overall combat, and even some of the boss designs. I like the game overall. Remnant does enough of its own thing to be fun like Dark Souls in very core and basic ways, like having fun and challenging bosses, while still maintaining its own twist on similar concepts. The game of course does some good things with its shooter focus, while still bringing in the basic fun of the things it stole from Dark Souls, even though I don't think for a second it's a copy or that it lives in the shadow of Dark Souls. I don't think it did enough of its own thing in some respects, or rather that the designers didn't really have the creativity to work with what they had in a way that complemented their game without using the same tricks over and over again. It's a game that takes clear inspiration from its source material, even taking some of the exact same ideas while still not being a clone, or even a poorly executed game. Let's get it straight, Remnant is not a clone. Its focus on shooting redeems itself from that title, and it's not a poorly executed version of itself either. It's its own original type of game that was done, overall, quite well in my opinion. I liked Remnant, even though I thought it was lacking in some places, and that these problems are what keep me from saying that I enjoyed it as much as Dark Souls, cause I don't like it as much as Dark Souls. These problems are, in my opinion, big enough to keep the game from being really great, or even as good as the source material. And we'll get into those problems right now. Hit it, Johnny! Oh right, Johnny died. So, our first topic is the core of the game's focus, the combat, and the fact that it isn't the same as its source material. These two things are actually one and the same, however. The game's combat defines itself from Dark Souls by being almost entirely different, despite still stealing things like boss abilities and dodging from Dark Souls. Remnant is a third-person shooter, firmly so, and Dark Souls isn't. More accurately, Remnant is firmly a third-person shooter, and Dark Souls is not. It's almost the exact opposite. Though Remnant takes from Dark Souls its inspiration for its enemies, its focus on dodging, or dealing with enemies' specific movesets, though obviously each game does this differently. Dark Souls is a melee game, Remnant is very much not. In fact, melee in Remnant is almost there just to serve the shooting. It's paid lip service to as far as its viability and focus in the game. Some enemies in Remnant can't even often be hit by melee, and you're going to often use your guns because they are just as powerful as your melee abilities, even if you have a melee-focused character. Guns are your primary weapons, and melee weapons are your secondary. You can use them if you'd like, to save ammo or just to deal damage at a closer range, or to activate melee hitting abilities like those on rings or weapons. Your melee weapon also doesn't have a modification, which we'll get into later, solidifying it as your secondary. Your guns are often just as powerful, do just as much or only a little bit less hit stun, go farther, obviously, and don't easily run out of ammo, considering ammunition is dropped very frequently by enemies, and bosses always have extra enemies or ammo lying around. Again, your guns are your primary, which is totally fine. You're still dodging defined and well-animated enemy attacks and projectiles. The lack of focus on melee being a similarly specific moveset you have based on your weapon is fine. The lack of melee combat being very important in service to the guns is perfectly fine. It doesn't devalue the enemies at all, which is the important part. Again, this is a third-person shooter first off, and melee comes last. So what about the shooting? How is that used? Personally, I feel as though the shooting of Remnant is sometimes used not as well. There were very few bosses that had especially hard spots to hit, or anything which asked you to shoot at things that weren't just the boss. That being said, enemies in Remnant have weak points that you can shoot at for extra damage, which is nice, but there's very often not something like, say, a floating nearby thing that you shoot at for a boss, or anything you shoot at that isn't just the boss or the enemy itself. A lot of the time, enemies in this game are just shooting at the enemy, dodging their attacks, and then shooting at the enemy again, and not much else. It's as if the game was made as a third-person shooter with Dark Souls enemies and dodging, and the latter part of that took over as the focus instead of the first part. Now, that's fine, but there were only 2 bosses I saw that had anything else to shoot at that weren't themselves and their weak spots. Those bosses were Claviger and Moonlight Butterfinger. One of Moonlight Butterfinger's attacks is a homing projectile which must be shot at to prevent you from getting hit by it. And Claviger has 2 orbs that you must shoot at that are away from him to weaken him to the point where you can deal damage to him directly. Obviously, I like the former of these 2 more because it's more challenging and makes better use of the fact that the player can shoot and is therefore more fun. Some enemies and bosses also, I'd like to note, make a token effort to try to do something as fun as this. The bee guys and their boss Scourge, who is the worst fucking boss in the game by the way, shoot out projectiles when you hit them that you have to dodge, shooting out more for each time they're hit. Some bosses like Shade and Shatter and Claviger also have shields that can't be shot through, which is nice. All of this is appreciated of course, but I just wish the game had more of this kind of thing. Of course, the game being focused on dodging enemies and dealing with projectiles as we stated before isn't a bad thing if that's what you're going for. However, I think that the game could focus on that, as it does, and add more of these kinds of elements. It's of course fine to want to focus on the player dealing with enemy attacks, that's perfectly fun, but this is a shooter, and we should play around more with that fact, by giving us harder targets, attacks that can be shot down or shot at, alternative targets like Totem Father does, or anything else that really plays with the fact that the player can shoot in this game, which this game sort of doesn't. One thing I do really like about this game though is that certain bosses can have parts of their bodies destroyed during their fight, which gives you an alternative reward for beating them. This is fun, because in a shooter it's very easy to designate where you want to hit your enemy, and it gives you a reason to go and fight the boss again for a slightly different fight. Again, the efforts this game goes to aren't unappreciated, it just doesn't go to the extreme that I think it should. Now, what about weapons? There's a lot of guns in Remnant, so they better be good, right? Remnant does its guns like Dark Souls, that is to say there are very specific weapons that all do a different thing. For example, the beam rifle is the beam rifle, and each weapon is as such. Weapons in Remnant are actually pretty fun. Each one does its own unique thing, having their own set of stats and way of shooting that makes every weapon usually a bit different than everything else. Some even have entirely unique projectiles, and some even have unique mods, which we'll get into later. The game has lots of fun guns to shoot with. Melee weapons are of course there too, however again their moveset almost doesn't really matter and there are only a few of them. It's cool that in a game that maybe doesn't care as much about its shooting, they at least cared enough to do this. It's just a shame that you have so many things to shoot with and almost nothing to shoot at. It almost makes a waste of the fact that we have so many different ways to shoot with at all if we're just going to use them to shoot a guy who's moving slowly. Melee weapons of course aren't nearly as good. They're more so just spamming left click. Melee weapons have a weak attack, a strong attack, an attack after dodging, and a charged attack. But most of the time you're just using the light attack. There are basically 2 separate movesets, sword and hammer is kind of bad. Some weapons have a separate move in their moveset while borrowing the rest from either sword or hammer, and some have a unique charge attack, but that's about it. Some of them also have a separate effect applied to them as well, which is nice. There is also one other moveset, but that's only used for 2 weapons that I know about, which is the spear moveset, which doesn't really do anything different than the sword one. The other obvious thing to talk about are the mods. The mods in this game are basically your spells. You attach them to your ranged weapons or they come pre-attached to certain boss weapons, and they're pretty cool. We'll get into these later though, but for now let's say that it's cool to have 2 different abilities that you can use in combat, and that overall these abilities are all quite unique and fun, though some of them are kind of crap. A select few are not very good, but overall they're great and one of the best parts of the game. That's about all there is to talk about on this topic, however. The combat in this game is quite good overall. The thing is though that the enemies are what really makes up most of the interest of the game and most of its focus. So while the combat is cool, mostly because of the mods, it's almost nothing without the focus on the enemies that the game has. Without the enemies, the combat isn't really much, because they're what the game is focused on. But before we talk about them, we're going to talk about levels. So, levels. Basically, the levels in Remnant work like this. Each level is semi-randomly put together with other parts of levels. For example, an area may be made up of different parts of levels that you might see in this area or in another area. The levels are assembled from a big bag of parts slightly randomly. For example, you might see one part of a level in one area and not another for your current run, but if you go into another campaign or adventure mode, you might see that other area. Some areas, however, are static and stay the same throughout multiple playthroughs. Enemy placement is therefore entirely random, including what kind of enemies you get. Although each world obviously has their own sets of enemies, and these levels as an overall picture are then assembled together back to back. Like you'll go through one randomly made level, and then another, and then maybe one randomly selected level, and then you might come across a boss after that, and then you'll have another level. Usually these levels have a central level that they either lead back into after you're done with them, or will have a dead end. There are 3 worlds that each have their own sets of levels, enemies, and bosses and encounters. This means that you may not see certain challenges or bosses on your first run through the game, and might need to use adventure mode to see them, which is cool. The enemy placement is of course random, both in where they are and exactly what you fight, and that's cool, but not exactly without problem. Let's talk about the good things. Because of Remnant's semi-random placement and selection of enemies, you're always going to have a unique challenge in every level. From the placement of a certain elite, to the combination of certain enemies, each level has its own set of enemies every single time you play it. The enemies in Remnant were designed well, to complement each other, meaning that every single challenge is not only challenging because of its elites, but also fun, because there aren't a bunch of enemies that don't work well with each other, or which aren't fun to fight at the same time in a single level. It has some of the benefit of randomization, and some of the benefit of a human's touch. The problem comes in that the designers can't have a finely crafted challenge in the form of enemy placement. In fact, they can't really have fine enemy placement at all. In Dark Souls there are times, many times, where a challenge comes entirely in the form of where a few enemies are placed, nothing more than that. Such as the 3 brutes in the tunnel leading to Blighttown, or the Silver Knight archers. Because Remnant's enemies are placed from a random selection, nothing like that can really happen. Of course, the enemies in Remnant are still good, and their selection usually provides a good challenge once an elite shows up for a small area, but there's never a place where an enemy is crafted to be there and to be challenging outside of random events. They also never have an enemy that is crafted to be challenging in itself. Now, I don't mean that the enemies in Remnant aren't made to be hard, or to provide a challenge when you face them. That's not true, they do, but there aren't enemies that are designed to entirely be a challenge, like the Black Knights, the Hydras, Iron Knights, or Hawks. Whenever the designers do design a challenge with very specific enemies, they come in the form of random events. Random events take the place of a boss in a given level, and almost every single one of them comes in the form of survive the onslaught of enemies that is about to descend upon you, which basically means the game is going to throw a great number of enemies at you, and you need to kill them all without dying. Usually these enemies are specifically placed, what kind of enemies you'll face are always exactly the same, and when they appear is the same as well. This challenge isn't always a bad thing, however it can be pretty grating when you realize that not only is this the only challenge they seem to have with little variation, but that you're also going to see it multiple times, and that throwing a bunch of enemies at you is, as we said, the only way to make the game hard. Now the latter part isn't as bad as the former. Almost every single one of these challenges is exactly the same. I haven't seen every single one, but all of the challenges except for 3 on Earth and 1 on Rom are the same. Now I don't have anything wrong with this challenge of surviving lots of enemies itself, there's nothing wrong with it, but it sucks that that's all they have. No special enemies, nothing like that. Even amongst these challenges, they're all the same, the only one that's any different being the Tale of Two Lizzes, where the challenge is slightly different because you have an additional objective of protecting 2 other NPCs, which I actually like. There isn't really much to talk about with the levels though. Again, they're randomly selected, so other than that they sometimes loop around to their hub level, they aren't really anything more than a way to shove you towards enemies, sometimes just as a line that you walk through to fight stuff. Some of the parts that are used to make a level are kind of cool, but oftentimes levels are just flat. There's almost never any hazards in Remnant in the levels, like water or fires to avoid or something. Not even like things that you're not supposed to shoot because they'll explode or whatever, which would work perfectly for a shooter. Maybe you could have patches of dirt you're not supposed to roll over, or really anything. There's almost nothing outside of things that spawn for certain boss arenas like Riphides, or in some very specific levels. There are sometimes little pods that you can blow up by shooting them to deal damage to enemies, which is nice, and there are some pitfalls on Rom, but that's it. It's an incredible shame that there isn't anything in a level that will kill you except for enemies. Why aren't there puddles of corrosive stuff or something anywhere? They've got all these different status effects, and they don't really use them. Maybe they thought it wasn't right for their game to have hazards like this, but I have no idea why you would think that. Like these big puddles of oil that Singe lights on fire are only ever used in his fight, and I understand that they wanted that to be an aspect of his fight. They wanted it to be a part of it because in that fight they serve a purpose. That purpose being something that he lights on fire and which light his additional enemies on fire. I get that, and this game definitely does have a recycling problem, but I think this might have been one of those things that could have been reused. Baffling. But yeah, aside from that, there's almost nothing to talk about. Levels are almost entirely just an excuse to push you towards some enemies and that's it, and there's no well-designed specific areas with specific or unique enemies, so... The thing is that it can't really be bad, right? Like, by the nature of something that is randomly assembled and is flat and wasn't designed, it maintains a level of safe, unenthusiastic quality. There can't really be like a bad level where someone just designed a poorly made level, or a good one because there's just not that much to them. There isn't the handcrafted artistry that gives a person the opportunity to fuck up. And that kind of sucks because it doesn't really end up making anything. Nothing is really bad, nothing is really good, it's all just kind of boring. They made all the parts, sure, but because they don't know how those parts fit together, they probably couldn't make anything that might get fucked up by, or fuck up its, surrounding parts. They did end up making some of the dungeons and those challenges I talked about earlier by hand, and while I appreciated those, they weren't really that significant. They did at least try though, and there are hints of a human designing them, so it's appreciable. I just wish they could have done something more like this in the rest of the game as well. So, now that we've talked about the levels, let's talk about the enemies. So, the enemies in Remnant are pretty good themselves. Every enemy has specific attacks, and almost everything is dodgeable. Lots of enemies have projectile and throwing attacks, which is good because you can shoot them at a distance. Some enemies also fly to make them harder to hit. Some enemies are ranged or melee specific and can only attack you with either of those types of weapons, like the brutes on Earth. Some of these enemies even have hit scan weapons that you can't entirely dodge and have to avoid or mitigate in some other way, which is fun. Enemies come in two different types: elites, which are the more significant enemies, and normal enemies, which are not. Normal enemies in Remnant are the ones you're going to be seeing more frequently. They're weaker, usually come in greater number, and don't have nearly as significant or as many attacks as the elites do. We'll quickly talk about the normal enemies because there's a lot to talk about in this topic, but normal enemies in Remnant are fine. None of them are really unfun or boring. They serve a purpose of being something you can partially ignore while still having a few different types of them and having a few different attacks of their own that are fun. There are no attacks from these enemies that are really significant or bad in any way. They usually only have 1 or 2 attacks each, and that's fine because of their purpose and because of the number of them that you can fight in each encounter. You'll usually fight anywhere from 3 to 10 normal enemies at a time, so it works fine that they aren't as developed as their elites. None of their attacks are bad, or poorly animated, or too weak or unfun to play against, and they even have a decent number of different kinds of enemies. Some enemies teleport, or throw bombs, or run at you and explode. There is some variety. However, there is also a case of the opposite problem. Some enemies are almost exactly the same, and a lot of them share the same basic kind of attacks. The Root have a basic enemy who does melee attacks and throws things, and so do the Yaesha. The difference being that the Yaesha can dodge melee attacks in some shots, and the Root can do this quick dodging thing when you aim at them. Other than that, they both have a projectile attack that they fire at you, and a melee attack that they do close up. Obviously the attacks are different, but a lot of the basic enemies are the same. Like, they had the same 4 ideas for basic enemies that they felt were right for the role these enemies play in the game, and they just slightly tweak the enemies themselves. It makes up that there aren't really as many enemies in the game as you think, because while they are slightly different, they're also mostly the same, and those differences don't really make up a new enemy. This isn't like Dark Souls, where an enemy's melee attack matters that much. Obviously it does matter, but enemies in Remnant matter more for what extra ability or effect they have, like the Pam's ability to dodge attacks, or the Bat's ability to explode after dying. Melee movesets do matter, but they don't matter as much as in Dark Souls. In Dark Souls, where you're going, what direction you dodge, how big a weapon is, etc., all really matter. In Remnant they just don't, because melee enemies that aren't elites don't have enough attacks to make it count, and their attacks are often able to be dodged in the same way every time, and they aren't slow enough for you to really pick a direction, nor are they animated in a way where that matters. Most importantly, you're also able to shoot them, meaning that you're not as often as close as you are in Souls, making it so that backrolling works most of the time. Now this doesn't apply to elite enemies, but we'll get into that later. As far as the projectile or throwing attacks are concerned, unless the projectile they fire is entirely different, they're basically just the same. They're slow, they usually go in a single direction, and are fired slowly. Only the bats out of the normal enemies really changes because they fire their projectile attack rapidly a few times in a row and then don't do anything for a second, making you dodge at a different pace. Now elites, however, take up the slack. They're like real enemies. Elites usually complement a couple of different normal enemies, and you'll only see 1 or 2 at a time unless you're in a challenge or a boss fight. Elites have a number of different attacks, and are all much more unique compared to each other and to their normal counterparts. Only a couple of elite enemies on Earth are kinda the same. Aside from them, every single elite is varied and fun. They're like the real enemy of the game, and of each encounter. Their attacks are all fun and unique for each one. They also have much more cool effects and abilities than their cousins. For example, the beehive guys will shoot out projectiles when you shoot at them, archers will teleport and can have their arrows shot out of their bows, summoners and casters will make their friends invulnerable to damage unless you shoot at them for a few seconds, and so on. Now I recognize that this is the way it should be, because these are the centerpieces for every fight or encounter. Obviously, the elites need to have more attacks, and they need to have attacks you can pay attention to, but I'm not sure I agree with their usage or their execution. Is it worth it to really have just these one good enemies in each of your encounters, and to make them a specific point of interest? Why not just give them less health and have more enemies that have more different kinds of attacks? This model almost seems like a scam to me, like a way to make fewer overall enemies and to just litter a place with these barely important, barely attention-worthy micro-enemies that are all the same. That's why I call the bigger enemies the real enemies. It's almost like instead of making a whole roster of real enemies, they just made a few real enemies and sprinkled a bunch of these other guys that are samey around them to make them harder. Now of course that doesn't mean that the normal enemies are bad or anything. I commend that they each have different attacks and a special twist on their basic attacks, like the aforementioned exploding spears on Ram or the dodging of the bandits on Yeisha. I don't think the basic enemies are bad, nor do I dislike them. However, I don't know if making half of an enemy, and then making a whole enemy, and surrounding the whole enemy with a bunch of half enemies, and making it harder is the best idea. Because if there's one thing this game likes to do, it's throw a bunch of guys at you, for better or worse, and it feels like the tendency to throw a bunch of enemies at you like I talked about before either influenced or was influenced by the fact that some of these enemies are supposed to be samey fodder. I don't think this is great, because if you have a bunch of very basic enemies, and you don't have very many different kinds of them, and you throw a bunch of the same kind of them at the player, it turns out to not be that challenging or fun. Especially if you end up making a bad enemy that isn't hard or fun to play against, then it ends up being annoying. For example, there's a skull enemy on Rom that has one simple attack. It fires a slow fireball at you and flies around to avoid getting shot. Overall, a fine enemy for something you can't pay attention to, but because of the factors we talked about before, you end up fighting upwards of 3 skulls in almost every fight in parts of Rom, and the enemy goes from being a simple fodder enemy into a really annoying fodder enemy. Not only because of the sheer number of them per fight, which makes fighting them just dodging repeatedly and trying to squeeze in shooting between dodges, but because of the volume of these fights that you have to fight. The game has a tendency to throw a great number of enemies at you without a great variety of those enemies, and since each enemy only has 2 attacks, you end up fighting the same guy with his same attacks many times. And I say for better or worse earlier because sometimes it's better, and most of the time it's worse. And that brings me over to the bosses, because the bosses in this game are so thoroughly disappointing that it's amazing. Almost every boss in this game has like 4 attacks, and they're easy. Now, not every boss is bad, some bosses are actually great, and they also only have 3 to 4 attacks. For example, my favorite boss in the game is Singed. Singed is great because while he only has around 6 attacks, he is made very well. Singed is a boss who has an arena, and enemies that work well with him and complement him greatly. Singed's basic design is that he has attacks that can power up his arena, and his additional enemy. He has 5 basic attacks. 2 melee attacks, a repositioning attack that shoots out a bomb or a line of bombs at you, a fireball attack that lights his additional enemies and the puddles in his arena on fire, a fire breath attack that does the same thing, and a power-up attack that draws your attention away from his important additional enemies and makes you take a second to put your focus towards him. The thing about Singed though is that he doesn't just have additional enemies that are just thrown in there to make him harder. He has very important ones that you have to pay attention to and deal with because they're very tough and can easily get you killed if there are too many of them or if you take damage from them. Because they're so strong, they take your attention away from Singed and make his power-up attack much better because he then takes your attention away from the immolators. It makes you balance how much attention you're paying, to deal enough damage to the boss per every few minutes that pass which take up your resources, and to whether or not you want to focus on an immolator that hasn't powered up yet or which is coming after you and is powered up, because that's another thing you have to pay attention to. It's a great fight. A great fight because his arena and his enemies complement his moveset. He isn't like other bosses in the game, where they just have a few different moves, and they sometimes throw in some other enemies to make it harder for you. Hell, sometimes the entirety of what a boss can do to his enemies is kill them, which I barely count. Yes, that means you can use their enemies to block attacks, but that's about it. For example, the Harrow is a boss who has a bunch of dudes placed into his fight just because it makes it harder. The Harrow actively goes around killing these enemies frequently, and sometimes they might deal damage to him. Why isn't that a part of his fight? Why doesn't he have a special enemy that he spawns when he spawns his adds that you have to try to have him kill, and when he does he loses armor or speed or attacks or something? Another boss is Totem Father, who has nothing to do with his other enemies. He places down totems, but those totems can't empower his additional enemies or make them faster or kill them or anything. He doesn't do anything to them. They're just there to make it harder, and while that fight is almost kind of good because Totem Father places down totems that you have to pay attention towards and kill, that's it. That's all they do. In Shroud's fight, they literally do nothing other than make it harder. He can't do anything to his enemies except sometimes kill them, and that is actually it. It makes you wonder why they even put them in there to begin with. Oh, that's right, because sometimes they barely even made a fucking boss. For some reason, there is an incredibly weird fucking phenomenon where a boss will literally copy not only the abilities, but most of the look or model from another enemy, or the other way around. Like, Shroud literally has some of his attacks from the Archer Elite enemy, and he has one additional attack that is his own. It's like they made a boss with one attack. Now, I would partially be okay with this if there were more bosses like Singed, but there aren't. A lot of bosses are more like Shroud. I get the idea behind this might have been to take what they have and maybe beef up the boss count a little bit. That's not commendable, but there's so many bosses like that I don't actually know whether they took an enemy they made and just said, fuck it, we'll make a boss, or they took abilities they had for a boss and said, fuck it, we'll make an enemy. I tend to believe the former because there are some bosses that are just so completely obviously the enemy they've copied from, with barely a ham-fisted or half-hearted attempt at making other abilities, that it astounds me. Remember Scourge, that boss from earlier? He literally has one other attack other than just doing the exact same thing his enemy does. He's almost exactly the same, he just does exactly what they do when you shoot them, but while releasing more blasts or spores or whatever you want to call them when you shoot him. And that's actually his other ability as well, is to defend himself in a circle and do the exact same thing he's already stealing from them and doing it bigger, but even biggerer. It's fucking amazing, and it was easy too. The Wikipedia claims he has one other melee attack too, that I haven't ever seen, but that isn't to be celebrated. He should have more than just two other attacks. Shroud doesn't even have an extra melee attack, he literally just has one other attack. That's it. A lot of the bosses are like that. Scourge, Shroud, Raze, Ancient Construct, Brabus, Shatterin, Shade, Mangler, and arguably many more have attacks that are taken from their respective similar enemy. They also only have around 2 attacks each, capping out at a whopping 4, and that's the high end of the spectrum, including these taken attacks, which is pathetic. The second phase of the final fucking boss of the game has 2 attacks. It's incredible. Want to hear the boss description for Brabus? Shoot shotgun and spawn more guys. Guess what attack he takes from the bandit enemy? Shoot shotgun. Want to hear the boss description for Maul? Charge and strike, and spawn ads. Guess what attacks it takes from the dog enemy? Want to hear the boss description for Raze? Shoot fireballs, and spawn ads, which he takes from the screaming triangle enemy. Now I know what you're thinking, but Caption, do they get more attacks if you play them on a higher difficulty, or do they just get more health and damage? Well, yes and yes. They sort of do. They usually take the form of either an attack taken from an enemy, or a small change to an attack that the boss already does. For example, on hard mode or higher, Ent will occasionally do his slam attack twice in quick succession instead of just once, and Shroud, instead of just having his teleport and shoot attacks, will also spawn explosions of rot that the summoner can on Earth. I'm actually not against this. Reusing of an attack to give something for a boss to do on a higher difficulty is fine. Dark Souls tried that by adding new enemies to fights, and I appreciate the idea here of giving a boss new attacks on a higher difficulty. I was hoping they were entirely new attacks, but taking old attacks or modifying existing ones is fine by me. It changes the fight, which is the important part. This game uses every part of the fucking buffalo, except for the parts that they don't use, which they should use. It's fucking astonishing. This recycling problem is so weird. I thought that maybe the designers thought they couldn't have a single boss without multiple ads that had a larger moveset just by themselves because of the guns in their game, but they didn't. They made Ixalis like that. Ixalis is a single boss that only has a second copy of itself, and it is really great. It has a projectile attack that you can shoot out of the sky, and multiple attacks that you dodge. Why is Ixalis like this and nobody else? Of course, I'm not saying that bosses that have this and no additional enemies are inherently good or better than the alternative. Singed is a great boss, and so is Ent, but why could there not be more bosses like this? Ixalis was great. As it is, some of these bosses are incredibly pathetic because they only have like 2 attacks, and that is an incredible shame. So, now we get to talk about the items in Remnant. There are, in fact, many different items in Remnant. Items in Remnant come in 2 forms: consumable items that deal with a status effect, and consumable items that provide some kind of small benefit for an hour. There are many different status effects in Remnant, so many so that I'm not sure that there need to be this many, because it makes it so that lots of the items in the game are just the corresponding cure for whatever that status effect is. There are 8 items in this game that all do the exact same thing, except for different status effects. It's just kind of silly. As far as these status effects go, they're actually kind of cool. Rot is one of my favorites. It occasionally makes your character start coughing. While they're coughing, they're unable to attack, reload, or dodge, which is cool. Corrosion ruins your armor's effectiveness, bleed deals damage over time, radiation reduces your maximum stamina, etc., etc. Each one does a different thing, and that's cool. The only two I don't like so much are bleeding and burning, because burning is just a worse version of bleed. They both deal damage over time, but burning can be reduced in its duration by rolling. As far as the other consumable items go, they're pretty okay too. There are only 4 though. Frenzy Dust, which increases your shooting speed, Adrenaline, which increases your movement and melee attack speed, Bloodwort, which heals you slowly, and ammo boxes, which refund all of your ammo. They're all fine, but it feels like there's room for other inclusions as well. There's just not much here is all, which is strange. Of course, there are other items too, the consumable items that provide a lingering effect for an hour after you eat them. These make up the bulk of the items except for all the status effect reduction ones, and these are pretty cool. They can provide anything from health to health regeneration to crit damage for an hour after you eat them, persisting through death, which is neat. I find it interesting that they went with this route rather than having these same items but with greater effects and a shorter duration. Maybe they thought that the effects of Bloodwort and Adrenaline were the only ones that could work for a short-term benefit, and I'm not sure that's totally true. Their effects aren't very subdued, as you would think, and they aren't very rare considering you can buy an infinite supply of them from their respective dealer, so I'm not sure why these don't vanish after death. They are more expensive, however, so perhaps that's what makes up for it. The duration is the main issue though. It's possible that they just didn't want the player to have to worry about keeping their items by not dying in their game, and I can understand that because they don't really affect your fight. They're just there to make it easier for you, and if you die, they were there for you to die with anyways, so they're just helping you with your fight, so it doesn't matter. However, an item that lasts for a shorter duration makes you want to get as much out of that duration as you can, and to use that item at a time when you can do that. You don't want to use a friendly dust when you're low on health and need to heal and not damage the boss. Armor and equipment make up the majority of the other items in Remnant, however, and they're pretty good. Equipment comes in 4 kinds: rings, charm, armor, and of course, weapons. Charms and rings each provide some kind of effect to the player, each having a different one. Their designs are varied, but overall quite good. You have rings that do things when you hit enemies, when you kill them, that affect your dodging and your shooting, and you have some rings that are just kind of uninspired, like the ring that helps you find money. The rings and charms that are the best, in my opinion, are the ones that have some kind of effect when you get hit, or when you hit and kill things, or when you dodge, not the ones that merely increase some kind of statistical element of your character. That's not to say those rings are bad, of course. I use the one that increases my melee attack speed on my melee character, and sometimes those are the most useful rings. I just don't think they're the best designed or the most fun. Armor, however, is much more interesting. Armor in Remnant works somewhat like armor in Souls. Each piece of armor has an armor value and a weight value. If you wear armor that is too heavy, it will affect your dodge, making it nearly useless if you wear far too much. They also each have a bonus for wearing the full set of armor. Each armor set provides an effect for the player for wearing any number of pieces for that armor, increasing in power for how much of that armor you wear. These effects are cool. There's armor that affects your dodging, gives you benefits for when you dodge and for not taking damage, that gives you effects for when you kill things, many different kinds of cool things. I like that these act as another way to define your character, and that you can mix and match these different kinds of armors to get multiple effects instead of just sticking to one. They allow you to give yourself benefits for things outside of your stats and rings, which is nice. You can go all the way with certain effects, or go half and half, or split between 3 totally different ones if you want a little bit of each. It's also appreciable that these armors are counterbalanced by their weight. You have to trade some of your armor as effects to possibly be able to roll with any effectiveness. Weapon mods, however, are even cooler than that. They are easily the coolest part of the equipment in Remnant. Weapon mods are additional abilities or spells that the player can use that are attached to their guns. These mods are either uniquely attached to certain boss weapons or can be changed out between others on certain other weapons, and they are very cool. They are abilities that the player can use, and these abilities are varied and fun. There are projectiles that apply a mark to enemies that make it so that when that enemy is shot again they explode. There are mods that allow you to spawn turrets or allies. There are mods that fire vortexes that suck enemies in and deal damage to everything in a small radius of that vortex. There are grenade abilities, radii of healing, and which reduce enemy armor. There's a great variety of different weapon mods, and almost all of them are fun to use and unique. There are only a few bad ones. For example, there are 2 nearly identical grenade mods, though one is supremely more effective than the other, and there are 2 different mods that spawn an ally for the player, though the allies these mods spawn aren't greatly different outside of the turrets. These mods do at least get affected by certain charms, and they are surrounded by a ton of mods that do really cool things, like the mod that spawns a plant that steals the enemy's attention, or the teleportation mod, etc. There are a great number of different mods that are all good, and an incredible number of them that are unique to certain weapons. Mods are easily the best part of the equipment, providing the player with fun to use abilities that make the combat better. Without these mods, the game and the combat would not have been as good as it was, and in fact, it might have been kind of bad. That, however, wraps up the last of my topics, and is about what I have to say about Remnant. So let's move on to conclusion. Again, I didn't dislike Remnant. It's a good game with overall good combat, fun mods and equipment, but with a really weird enemy and boss problem where the enemies and bosses were not only short in number, but also wildly reused and sometimes far too easy outside of Nightmare mode. It kinda feels like a game that ran out of money, but a lack of money doesn't really justify some of these shortcomings. Overall, the game is good, and I enjoyed it, and I would look forward to a Nightmare mode run, or any large DLC or other additions to the game. The thing is that Remnant has had some things added to it for free. So if the designers were willing to add new bosses, or even just go back and add new attacks to other bosses, this game could be a lot better. The fact that there's free stuff coming out for this game at all shows that the future for it might be incredibly bright, so it might be something to look forward to if what I said here didn't excite you. I would personally be interested in any kind of expansion, because I think that could have the potential to be really fun. Thank you all for watching, and join me next time when we play Borderlands 3, which will be coming soon.